Welcome back into Trailblazers Courtside. Jordan Kent alongside Michael Holton. We are now fortunate to be joined by Scott Howard Cooper of NBA.com. And Scott, first of all, how are you doing this evening?
I'm great. I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving.
You know, we did. I'm still trying to work off some of that turkey, a lot of that gravy, and a whole lot more of that pumpkin pie. Michael, what about you?
I'm trying to still work in some more desserts.
And so, Scott, let's talk about over excess. And when it comes to this, I mean, the offenses in the NBA, are we seeing a trend in the last couple of years with the three-point shot continuing to develop of teams in the NBA just scoring so much more that it's making it life difficult for any team trying to establish a good defense in the league?
I don't think it's making it difficult. There's some teams out there that obviously are still able to play that side of the ball as well. But there's no question, as you mentioned, that the league has changed over the last several years, and things have become much more focused on three-point shooting and the smaller lineups that allow teams to play fast. And so scoring will be going up. And then you have certain unique situations like a team like the Warriors. You have so many offensive weapons in one place. And you have a little bit of that in Portland, where you have two dynamic offensive players in the backcourt together. It's not spread across the entire team like it would be in Golden State, but there are some situations where you have two or three big-time scorers in the same lineup, and those are the things I think that give the defenses nightmares.
As you look at the almost quarter mark of this first part of the season, as you look around the league, what has really surprised you the most at this point of the season?
Well, I never would have expected Dallas to be sitting at the bottom of the Western Conference. I didn't have the Mavericks as a championship contender, but I certainly didn't have them at 3 wins. That to me has been one of the big surprises of the entire league.
And as you continue to take a closer look at this Portland team, Dame, CJ, they retain a lot of the same pieces in this lineup. What is it about Dame and CJ, when you look at some of the other scoring duos in the NBA, that's unique about what these two players do?
Well, they play so well off each other. You don't have this situation about worrying who's going to get the shots, because they're both going to get their shots. They're both players that have three-point range and yet are distributors as well. They'll give the ball up to each other, to their teammates, just as much as they're willing to take the big shots themselves. I think that's one of the things that really separates Dame from most everybody else in the league, is his ability in the clutch. And you don't necessarily see that in games in November, but you know when it gets down the end of the regular season, into the playoffs, anytime during the season when you're down and late in the fourth quarter of a close game, he's a guy that not only will accept the moment, but he wants that moment. He wants the pressure, and he showed that he obviously can produce in those clutch situations. And CJ has just come so far over the last few years. The big question with him was much more about his health than about his ability. It was a matter of the foot, and if he can never get that right, he's got a chance to be a good player, and he's turned into a very good player. He's just so impressive in so many ways.
And I'm also curious, we're at the quarter mark of the season, as I stated. For a lot of these teams that have new pieces in the NBA, at what point can you really start to realize, okay, this team is who they are going to be? Is the quarter mark still a little too early in the season to get a true pulse of what teams are going to be like?
I think that's a fair assessment. Unless you have a really unique situation, maybe one team, one of their key guys has been injured, something like that. You want to give them a little bit more time. And by no means is this a moment for anybody to be panicking and saying, gosh, they're going to be in the lottery if we expected them to be a pretty good team. And by the same token, it's not the time to be saying, well, my goodness, these guys are going to win the championship, because they've had a pretty good start. There's still a long, long way to go, but I think as you get close to the quarter mark of the season, you start to have a pretty good body of work in general. Again, there's some cases where teams have been dealing with injuries, but I think now is a pretty fair time to get an assessment on people.
You know, Scott, I want to ask you about, we just had a graphic up talking about the top three scoring duos, Golden State,
Dame and CJ.
Cleveland, Dame and CJ. And we talk a lot about guards, and in a lot of ways, I like to say it's a guards league. I mean, they have the ball all the time. They make things happen. But I want to ask you a question about the current state of affairs for bigs in the NBA, because it feels like, at least in my basketball lifetime, I feel like I haven't seen as diverse a group playing the same position. I mean, you've got stretch fives in today's game, and you still have some back to the basket power players, more in the East and the West. I want to get your take on the state of affairs at the, I guess you can't even call it the center position anymore because it's not on the All-Star ballot. The big guys on the court.
Yeah, well, you're right on the semantics of it, that what we used to know as centers now aren't necessarily those centers that we're familiar with. There's very few of those guys. To be a successful center these days, unless you're completely tearing people up in the post, unless you're just blowing through people when you get the ball inside, the new model are guys like Karl Anthony Towns, who have such good range. And Joel Embiid, he's been hitting three-pointers this season, which I think has been a surprise. So when you talk about some of the really good centers, everybody's the move is to go small, and or at least to have that option, at least to have that club in your bag. Look at the Warriors again, a perfect example. Draymond Green coming into the NBA out of Michigan State a few years ago. The big question was, well, he's a tweener. Is he a power forward or is he a small forward? And the game has changed so much that the question is now, how much center will he play? And the answer is quite a bit, and in that small lineup. So, yes, there's no question that things have gotten smaller, but also, Michael, as you mentioned, the way the game has changed, that some of these guys have such great range, even 7-footers. It's pretty amazing.
Scott, you look at a guy that I know you cover now, DeMarcus Cousins, and he's kind of a hybrid in that I think he has a power game and likes to go to it on occasion, but he's also now has three-point range and can get to the hole from the three-point line. So I guess the question I'm trying to now ask you about is the power player, whether he's at the 5 or the 4. I know you just recently did an article on one of the league's better power forwards of his time in Brian Grant. What's happening with the power part of the game with big guys?
A little bit like we were just talking about with the centers, in that the game is shrinking and the power is still there in some cases. You're right, DeMarcus Cousins does have a lot of that power, but these guys are stretching the floor, and DeMarcus is a great example that this is a guy that's developed much better range than he had coming in. He had a ton of potential. When they talk about high ceiling guys, DeMarcus certainly fit that mold coming into the NBA. He did not have the three-point shot. He does now. It's good enough that you have to respect him, and that's the case with a lot of the guys. Again, we go back to some of the, when you talk about who are some of the really young but promising big guys. Karl Anthony Towns was Rookie of the Year last season. Joel Embiid has gotten off to such a good start. He's the clear early favorite this season, and both of those guys can hit three-pointers. And it's the same thing at the power forward position. It's not as much power there as it is about the speed and the three-point shot, the range on the shot, where it used to be an oddity if one of your bigs, whether a power forward or center, could be hitting from 18, 20, 22 feet. Now, not only is it common, but it's become sort of expected on teams to have at least somebody that's able to fit that mold.
Scott, as a result of bigs developing perimeter skills, whether they're three-point shooters or passers, I mean, Mason Plumlee's an excellent example of a center that's not necessarily a three-point shooter, but he's very skilled on the perimeter in terms of passing and making plays for other people. That inverted offense, bigs being out on the floor, do you think it's contributing to an increase in fast break points because now they are at the top of the floor trying to be the first line of defense in transition?
I don't even know. That's a great question. I had never thought of that. I don't know if that's the reason, or as much as just over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been much more of a focus around the league from a coaching standpoint and a front office perspective of playing fast and getting out in transition. Certainly if you have the big man that can pass, that gives you a great advantage. And not so much when you play inverted, because if that's in a half-court set, that's completely different. But a name that, here's a perfect example, a name that people in Portland are obviously familiar with, Kevin Lowe. That's one of the things that he was able to do since college, and I suspect even high school, is get the defensive rebound and have those great outlet passes. And that's one of the ways that the bigs contribute to the fast break, is if you have the guys that can just take it off the glass and snap it out and get the break going, that, I think, is as big a reason as when they're in the half court or in much more of a running out of sets, and maybe that you have the inverted.
Scott, now you're a Sacramento guy, and I want to ask you, with the Kings, what do you foresee is the long-term plan for Sacramento? Because they obviously were able to retain the franchise a couple years ago when there were some talks about it maybe leaving. But when you look at them as a franchise with their roster, what do you see them trying to do over the next couple years, as clearly they're in the Western Conference with Portland, an opponent they're going to be very familiar with?
Well, I can tell you what the plan is, but I would also say that there's a very good chance that the reality is something else. Their plan is to keep this roster together and rely heavily on the veterans, guys like DeMarcus Cousins and Rudy Gay, and they're hoping that Darren Collison has a long future, and then a guy like Willie Cauley-Stein fitting in, Costa Koufos. But here's the truth. They have very, very few players on this team that they want to keep. And it's a bad roster. They can talk all they want about seeing the future, but it's a big difference between what they say and actually getting there. And I would go so far as to say that if you were to take the 15 teams in the Western Conference, is there any roster you like less in, say, 2 years from now? Even the teams at the bottom. Now, Dallas is a little bit of as I mentioned at the top, has faked me out quite a bit. I think that that's a team that's in transition. They've loaded up so much on veterans that you could say, well, in 2 years they're going to be in trouble because they staked everything on one last push with Dirk Nowitzki. So maybe Dallas, but even the other teams down at the bottom. Phoenix, much better younger talent. Minnesota, much, much better younger talent. Denver, the Lakers, the Jazz. Maybe New Orleans is the one you're not sure about because they have one guy that you'd say, we know for sure he's a keeper, Anthony Davis. Then maybe you're saying Buddy Hield. There's certainly reason to say we have reason to believe this guy's a nice prospect. But if you look at the Kings, you can't trust your best player to be the foundation of your team because he's undependable. And there's a very good chance they'll be looking to trade Rudy Gay soon. They want to get a different point guard in there instead of Darren Collison and Ty Lawson. The roster is a mess right now. I know their hope is that these veterans are going to come through and that they're able to make a playoff push once and for all, but I don't think it's going to happen.
You hear about big threes when we've seen Miami, Boston, Golden State, Cleveland. Do you think that's the way teams are going to try to start operating now, is to put themselves in a position to create a big three? Or will there be opportunities for teams to develop their own talent that they're drafting and not having to go the free agent route and bring in somebody from somewhere else to really be that final piece? Or is this just sort of the way it's going to be now?
Well, it depends on the situation. If you're somebody like the Warriors, the Spurs, the Clippers, the Cavs, the Raptors, those kind of teams, you're not sitting there on draft night in June saying, boy, let's get somebody here that'll help push us over the top. You're saying we're gonna make our mark in free agency and in trades, and that's how we're going to add the big names. Conversely, if you're one of the other teams, like as we mentioned, Minnesota, certainly Philadelphia, Brooklyn's in that situation now. Then for the most part, you are developing through the draft, and you have to mix in with the trade. Maybe you get a nice free agent pickup, but big-time free agents aren't going to go to teams that are looking at another couple years in the lottery. So that's where it has to be developed in the draft for the younger team. Now, if you're asking me, do teams want to have a big three? Well, sure. Everybody wants three really good players, right? That's certainly the case, but it has to be the right three players. We've seen situations in the past where teams will get a roster together, and you'd say, boy, that's really good, and it just doesn't fit. The Lakers a few years ago come to mind with Dwight Howard and Steve Nash and Kobe Bryant, and that obviously not only didn't work, but it It really didn't work. It didn't work to historical proportions when everybody expected that the team would be good. So it's not just a matter of going out and getting all-stars or getting guys that have a big name on the marquee. It's got to be the right fit, because not only in the chemistry, but in the way the guys play together or don't play together in some cases.
All right, Scott, thanks again for joining us, and we certainly appreciate your time.